You're my favorite, Ross. Do y'all agree? Hot Annie Leibovitz? Oh, wow. Okay, so before we start, little ticker things going. This is my big fear. Talking in public, not my fear. My joke in my family is I was born talking. Never been an issue. 18 minutes really freaks me out. Everybody else here today is doing really good on the 18-minute mark. I just need to share that with you, that the 18 minutes has got me a little freaked out. I have never given this talk before. I talk about these things a lot, but this amazing opportunity to be with Nashville. I really love Nashville. I've been here a lot. You guys have been good to me. Is that I get to think of this in a new format, in a new way. And I'm going to tell you one more little thing about why Ross is my favorite at the moment is I told him I was freaked out about this 18-minute thing, which includes thoughts in the early morning of like, 18 minutes. Why not 17? Why not 20? 18 minutes. TEDx, what is that about? And he just looked at me and goes, well, you know, the really good thing is, he's like, what comes after you is the break, so we've got a little leeway. So I was like, so I think I just burned a minute here telling you this. Thank y'all. And the other great thing is I just got to make up the title of this talk. I think I made up post-journalism world, and I think that would freak out most of my friends who still work for newspapers, that I would actually use that term post-journalism. But you know what? That's where we live today. If we consider that for most of humanity's lifetime, information was a scarcity. It was hard to get. Nobody had the printed word. I want to read for you what was created in the 19th century that brought us to the place we are today. The telegraph, photography, the rotary press, the transatlantic cable, movies, the penny press, the modern magazine, the advertising agencies, and the computer. They're all 19th century. And they all pushed us to this place in the 20th century of information, which in fact was the newspaper age. It's where we got most of our news. I'm not going to go into the statistics about the newspapers that are gone and the changes in distribution models, because I want to use this time to talk to you about something that I really care about, which is storytelling. And it's how we make sense of the world that we live in. And I am a huge, huge fan of, whoops, we went past a Neil Postman slide. Neil Postman is this amazing social critic who passed away a few years back. And he says what happened in the 20th century with this information age where we're just getting all this data and zeros and ones, we created a new problem never experienced before. Information glut, information incoherence, information meaninglessness. We have transformed information into a form of garbage and ourselves into garbage collectors. How about that? Neil Postman said that in 1995. He wrote it in an article in the Utne Reader. And in that same article, information comes indiscriminately, directed at no one in particular, in enormous volume, at high speeds, severed from import and meaning. Before Facebook, before Twitter, before all the things that are barraging us today, Neil Postman wrote that. And there is no loom to weave it all into fabric. No transcendent narratives to provide us with moral guidance, social purpose, intellectual economy. Neil Postman's words inspired me. I was still a writer at the time when I read them, and it made me reflect on my first encounter with a sense of information overload, in particular imagery overload. I went to an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in in Boston, of the great watercolorist Winslow Homer. And one of the first images I encountered was this. Winslow Homer covered the Civil War for Harper's Weekly. One painting a week. At the time I saw this picture, it was the first Iraq War. It was an era when MTV was beginning. There was jump cut editing. It was the beginning of this faster pace. We have 24/7, CNN going nonstop with that news. And I stood in front of that picture and I thought, one painting a week? How would we absorb the information about a war if we had one? Just one. How would you do it as the illustrator? What do you tell the nation that week about that image? It blew my mind. I wrote a piece for the Boston Globe, their op-ed pages, about our loss of visual literacy, the loss of a space where one image has meaning. And I asked people, what's the last great image you remember? What stands out as a moment? And people go back to Nick Utt's famous photograph of the Vietnam War, the girl who's been napalmed running down the road. a famous French photographer, Marc Ribot, covering a protest, a Vietnam-era protest at the Pentagon. And this next one by Eddie Adams, which he has regretted himself for many years, the execution of a Viet Cong prisoner by a South Vietnamese army general, an image that he later tried to explain in many ways, but which is seared into public consciousness as an image of that war. Where were the still images that we could remember? That's what I wrote about at that time. It was my journey. Oh no, we need to go here first. This is Think Vertically. Now, I don't know how many of you are that real TED type of audience who's into that whole kind of like vertical thinking is the old school, you know, it's going up and down the ladder and not solving things in a company, and that to think laterally is better. I want to turn that on its head because we need to think vertically. We need to understand stories vertically. This is falling off my ear, sorry you guys. If we live in this information age where more and more information is coming at us, think of yourselves, all the speakers have touched on it today. You know, we're just going like pushed by information, by cell phones, it's like this deep, it runs us. We need the spaces to go vertically, to live with information, to reflect on it, to weave the fabric that Neil Postman talked about, to make sense of these things so that we understand more about who we are and where we're going and what matters and what our values are. Because that constant flow of 24/7 with every news story you can ever imagine, having a banner headline and a new name for it, it doesn't give us anything that helps us understand how to live our lives. So I began a journey that, a whole nother talk, I lost my faith in words in the mid-90s. I had a personal crisis in my life, and words which had always been righteous and meaningful and solved things and moved people for me failed me when I needed them to do something. And I picked up a camera and began to see the world in a different way. It put my life back together, but it also redefined who I am. I moved from being a strict journalist to somebody I would call myself a storyteller. And that's what we're talking about today. And the things I'm going to share with you are the lessons I've learned as a visual storyteller. My first project was about the aftermath of the war in Bosnia. I found myself, when I wanted to begin long-term work, I was drawn, again, a whole other story. We're getting this sort of shorter version. I'm actually giving you that little layer of stuff today, but we're going to go deep with it by the end, I hope. I wanted to go cover the aftermath of a conflict that the West had done a pretty lousy job of paying attention to and covering. And I was drawn by this deep desire to find the things that connect us. I knew a TV producer who once said to me when I was still a writer, there's no more compelling image to show famine and starvation, and this was around the time of We Are the World and Live Aid, than a picture of a baby with a distended belly and a fly crawling across its face. And even then, I wasn't a visual person, but I was like, wow, I think that works once. You know, you see that photo once. You know, everybody was kind of shocked after Live Aid was over, if you remember that period, if you're more like my age. It's like, oh my God, there's famine in Africa again. But we solved that. We did Live Aid. What are you talking about? You know, so it's like that image works once. And then it either shocks you, and generally images like that are shocking. And shock is like, leads us to paralysis or to a fight or flight thing. And I don't want to do that with my work. I want to find the way that says to you, we're connected. We're human beings. And if I can relate to you as a human being, if my work as a writer was always, if I can get you to care, then maybe I can get you to think. And if I can get you to think, then perhaps I can get you to act. So I'm not in for the shock and paralysis and headline thing. I'm trying to find the spaces that let us go, what does it mean to be human? This is an image for me of what it means to be human. It's the signature image from my work, Aftermath, Bosnia's Long Road to Peace. This is a Bosnian Muslim widow. She's looking into body bags of recently exhumed victims of Muslims who were deliberately targeted and killed by their Bosnian Serb neighbors during the war. The sanitized, ugly name for that was ethnic cleansing. But in this image, I'm trying to take you by the hand. I'm not trying to make something pretty, but I'm giving you the space to reflect on something, to see that my work at this time was very influenced by fine art. It's a very Vermeer type of lighting. I'm trying to say, come on. You know, there's a story ahead that we've got to look at, and it's kind of hard, and maybe you don't want to consider it if you're warm and comfortable homes in the West. But this is part of what it means to be human. So in this project, I kept looking for these things. This is a building that had been destroyed. I'm interested in the effect of the war on children. This was a mannequin head that was used for target practice during the war in Sarajevo, which was right literally between buildings at times within the city. Home, what does home look like? How do you rebuild it? Why do you want to go back to a place that somebody, deliberately forced you from, raped or killed you as a means of intimidation? I was amazed by people who wanted to go home. The story of the exhumations, the 20,000 or more Bosnian Muslims who were killed during that war, and trying to find and identify your loved ones again to bring closure. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with, in a business suit and umbrella, walking through that? It's a disconnect, and at the same time, this comment on life going on. This is a neighborhood where Muslims had returned after literally being forced out and their homes burned to the ground. This was the Miss Bosnia contest, which was held in the Holiday Inn, which was made famous by all the war correspondents who were there and made that their headquarters during the war. This is what happened later. It's like, how do we live again? Just because the guns stopped, it doesn't mean there's peace. It's like, what on earth does it take to rebuild a civil society? What are the things that relate us to each other that allow us to do that? This is the cover of the book. Which works very much out of my metaphorical work. It's a very famous curator out of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston asked me if I thought this was a picture of about healing, and I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "It's all about that. It's all about the desire for a return to beauty and light." These are young people waiting for Danis Tanovic to come home to Sarajevo right after he won the Oscar for his film about the war, No Man's Land. These are students going to their senior prom in Bijeljina, which is the town where Muslims were first killed at the very beginning of the war and where very few Muslims have returned. This is a rainbow over the town of Mostar, which was destroyed across lines and where the famous Mostar Bridge was rebuilt. A very rare picture from my first trip. I had no idea how unusual it would be. These were Muslims and Serbs who remained friends in the town of Srebrenica, which is where the massacre of Muslim men and boys occurred in 1995. This is the rebuilt bridge of Mostar, and a 500-year-old practice of jumping off the bridge and getting money from tourists for doing it, a day of great joy. Yeah, I also I just tell you as a photographer, I deliberately don't show you the water below, because part of the question of this project is where are we going? Where are they going? What's happening? This is the last picture in the book. It kind of counterpoints the first picture you saw of the widow. Looking into the body bags. This is a Muslim widow looking at a town where Muslims have not been able to return yet. But for me, the difference as a photographer in my journey of the 5 years it took me to make the work was from looking into body bags and being quite angry with the world that we'd walked away. At least I've come to a place where I can look towards a horizon and think that maybe there's a different story to come. This work led me to start a nonprofit called the Aftermath Project. I realized that, at the time nobody knew who I was as a photographer, that if I wanted to have any kind of an impact, I wanted photographers to realize they could become aftermath photographers and not conflict photographers. And this is a whole nother story as well, but we are in our 7th year of granting. We published 5 books so far that are sent to every U.S. senator, peace-building programs, journalism programs, museum curators, educators. We've developed curriculum. And we give a grant every year to a photographer to explore a post-conflict story. And we recognize finalists for their work. This is a project about the aftermath of Wounded Knee, the 19th century massacre on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation by Danny Wilcox Fraser. This is a finalist project called about a woman's war. These are portraits of women who fought in the Bangladeshi War for Independence and the struggles they face currently in their society by Elizabeth Herman. This is a project from Guatemala by Miquel de Weber Plana about the way a civil war that's not addressed within a society creates new generations of violence. And it's a project about gang violence in Guatemala today. This is by Catherine Cook. Her project was called Memory Denied, Turkey and the Armenian Genocide. This is a finalist, Andrea Bruce, who has done an incredible job of documenting the impact of the war in Iraq on Iraqi civilians, stories we don't tell. The impact by Louis Palou, the impact of war on veterans. This is an example of our book. It's our current book. I have to go over here and look at this little thing. 14, okay, we gotta go. We're kicking it in here. So my second lesson, define humanity, embrace community, which I've learned in my current work from Africa, which is, we'll get to that. It's the word Ubuntu is a word from South Africa that says, because you are, I am. It's African humanism. It really means that I can't exist without you. It's what fueled the Truth and Reconciliation hearings in South Africa. It's what's at the heart of the work that I've been doing. This constant desire to reintegrate the offender into the community. A concept totally foreign to the West. And all I could think about is, why do we keep trying to tell Africa how to do things? Why do we keep trying to say, do it this way, use our justice, when they seem to know a lot more about a lot of things than we do? This is the project that I won the Guggenheim for this year, Forgiveness and Conflict, Lessons from Africa. We're going to go quickly through it. But it's been such an amazing learning curve for me. My first film, documentary film, Fambul Tok, which played here in Nashville 2 years ago, came from this project about a program in Sierra Leone. This is the man I first met in Sierra Leone. He was the first amputee of that war. And from him, I learned the story of being willing to forgive. Because he said, if I take revenge on my perpetrators, then his children will take revenge on mine, and my grandchildren on his grandchildren. And that's the way you have generational conflict. And what we want is peace. And I just looked at him. I was so amazed, because at that moment, the war that was going on in the world was in the Middle East. Israel had invaded Lebanon for like the umpteenth cycle of violence. And all I could sit there was think, wait, we've called you the dark continent, and yet somehow you've found that magnitude of humanity that says, I want peace for my children, not conflict. So that's where the project began. I've worked with ex-child soldiers. They've used the camera and told me their story metaphorically. This is a story of Miriam, who was abducted at the age of 11. These are my pictures of her story. She took pictures. She explained an astounding capacity to use visual storytelling as metaphor to tell her story. She says, this is me. This child was actually named after her by a friend. This is me. This baby lies the same way I did. She knows my story, how I felt when I was raped. That's exactly how I lied down in the road and begged the rebels not to rape me. You know, it was her way of telling her own story. I didn't change her life. I kind of get really annoyed with people who run around and say they've given cameras to street children and made their lives better. Because, you just gave cameras to street children and maybe you sold photos or something. It doesn't change anything that way, but letting somebody tell their own story is pretty powerful. And in fact, she insisted I take this picture of her with my camera in the mosque where she goes to seek forgiveness. It is good for me to make these photographs. It allows me to reflect on what has happened in my life. This is northern Uganda. We're going to come back to this in a little bit, but I was there when the Lord's Resistance Army went around the country, had delegates going around the country to apologize for the violence they had inflicted on the population. These are women at a meeting where the Lord's Resistance Army delegates have apologized, and they're asking them, what would you like us to do? And the women at this meeting said, we want you to come home. We want, because our children you abducted, and they're our children, they're not rebels. We want you all to come home so that we can reintegrate you into our community. Sierra Leone has been the bulk of the work. It's where Fambul Tok, the film, is from. I was able to witness the rebirth of a cultural tradition of resolving conflict through conversation, in which at bonfires, well, this is to get over the scars of the war. This is a room that was used to slaughter people. This is a man who literally bears the scars of the war. He was tattooed by the rebel forces. And this program, Fambul Tok, is the rebirth of the community. Fambul Tok means family talk in Creole in Sierra Leone, and it means you come to the table. You talk things through to resolve conflict. At the heart of it is what's at the heart of every African tradition of being willing to forgive. The offender tells the truth, asks for apology, and is forgiven. Those are like a cultural norm. The work that takes place afterwards is reconciliation takes time. But in this program, this man has apologized to this woman for beating her child so severely that she was killed, she died during the war. And this woman has chosen to forgive him. When I interviewed her the next day, it's in the film, I was like, who told you to think this way? She has this amazing moment of just leaning back and kind of looking at me like, you poor white girl. And she says, we can think for ourselves on these things. And I was like, oh, thank you, Miriam. I knew right where that line was going in the film, because it could be right about the point where a Western viewer would be watching the film going, oh, right. What are these people doing? They don't know what they're talking about. And there's Miriam saying, yeah, we can think for ourselves on these things. This is the moment of forgiveness, kind of a bad picture. This young man had killed his best friend's father during the war. This is the first time they've spoken 17 years later. And this is the moment you bend over to completely subjugate yourself in front of the person you've harmed. This is the community celebration, dinner afterwards. This is the rice harvest. It's where the perpetrators and their victims come together in the community to make farms. It's a way of reuniting community. Those are the two young men, the one who'd killed the other boy's father. Well, jumping along, I forget what I've actually got. The next slide is, sorry, we jumped that quickly from that one. I just really hope to tell me somebody grew up with Lost in Space in the audience. Do y'all remember? Thank God. Because I just had visions of putting this slide up and going, they're going to go, what is she talking about? I just personally, it has absolutely nothing to do with the talk, but I just personally can never say danger without going, Will Robinson, danger. So that's for that. Because there really is a big danger in this whole thing, and it's visual literacy. Without these stories, without visual literacy, we are sunk because there are so many stories out there on the internet, and they're photoshopped photos that you don't know what's real or what's not, and there are stories that go around and urban legends, and we sure do jump on a heck of a lot of things like this one. Oops, sorry. I can't see what's coming next on the thing. I just want to revisit visual literacy with you very quickly. So Winslow Homer painted this painting of the war. Look at this tree branch. You see it right there in the middle right-hand side of the picture? What does that look like to you? The barrel of a gun, the end of a cannon. It's a tree branch, but the artist is choosing to say to you, this is the Civil War. That gun is pointed at us. We're killing ourselves. I guarantee you he made that choice as an artist. Just like I made this choice as an artist in Bosnia, where that hand railing, it looks like a gun. And I'm putting the child right in the trigger of the gun and talking about what the impact of war is on children. That's a quick rundown of visual literacy. We're out here in 30 seconds. My own personal next is to take this work to Detroit, where I was born, in the form of a storytelling institute that involves photography, filmmaking, and community storytelling. My own Nashville personal next includes being back here in 2 weeks. I hope you all come to the premiere of my next film, which is at the Nashville Film Festival on the 19th. It's about folk musicians, but it's also a story about humanity and community. And I want to leave you with this last thought from the great Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe, who just died. Only the story can continue beyond the war and the warrior. It is the story that saves our progeny from blundering like blind beggars into the spikes of the cactus fence. The story is our escort. Without it, we are blind. So I hope you tell more stories and figure out what you want to tell in stories, and you embrace them, and you give them meaning, and you share them, and you teach your children stories that are going to take us into the next generation. Thank you.